This is Evolution and Natural Selection, an EOG review. My name is Ms. Crum, Apple Valley Middle School. So evolution, there are several key misconceptions about evolution. Evolution is driven by mutations in genes and sexual reproduction, which lead to increased variation, meaning that not everything is the same. All humans are not the same. There's a variety of nose sizes and heights and hair colors and all sorts of wonderful variety, which creates variation within our species. That is the result of sexual reproduction. You are not just a clone of your mother or your father, and you're not even a perfect mix of both. If you were to say Photoshop your face and take two pictures of your mother and your father at the exact same age you are now, you could not just take mom's eyes and dad's nose and create a perfect you, because there are some traits, some genetic mutations which are inherently you. These mutations are random, and most of the time they don't have one impact one way or the other. The only time this comes into evolution is if they become advantageous. So it's the result of reproductive success. So when we say it's advantageous, we mean that it has helped certain individuals survive to the point where they are able to reproduce and pass on those genetic traits, versus others of the same species who didn't have that genetic mutation or that variation. They died. So this is a life and death thing. Evolution is not something that can happen to individuals in a lifetime. It is changes that happen in a species over time as a result of environmental changes. So we studied about the finches in the Galapagos. Right, there was a drought, and that drought made large seeds very hard to come by. And so small little seeds were abundant, and the finches with the bigger beaks had a hard time eating those little tiny seeds which were abundant. They starved to death in droves, and like 80% of them died. And the only ones that survived were the ones that just happened to have a slightly bigger beak of that same species. And so what happened is the researchers found out that within the next reproductive cycle, the average beak size for that species actually increased a measurable amount. That was evolution happening on a micro scale with that species in that location as a result of environmental changes. So evolution, a lot of times people get confused about the words theory of evolution. A theory is the explanation for a wide range of observable facts within the natural world. So it's not like someone's idea. It's the explanation for what we can see happening over and over and over again. So those are things that evolution is. This is what people think it is, but are mistaken. So it is not changes made by an individual organism during their lifetime. If I'm a little bunny rabbit and it suddenly starts getting colder in my environment, I'm not going to start just growing thicker fur because I decide that that's a good thing to do because it's really cold outside all of a sudden. What might happen is those within my species, just like how I have a certain hair thickness and my neighbor might have a different hair thickness, rabbits will have a slightly different variation. Maybe the person with the thicker hair would survive. The bunny with the thicker hair would survive. Even though they're the same exact species, the other one died and didn't get to pass on those genetic traits. So it wasn't a choice. They weren't like, oh, if only I could grow more fur. It's just either you had the warm fur and that helped you when the climate changed, or you didn't and you kicked the bucket. So it's not a choice or decision to be made, and it's also not a linear progress towards an ideal. There's no ideal form that we're moving towards. It's very much random of what works for that environment. Evolution is tied to genetics, and therefore reproduction and environment, and that's it. It's also not the product of just one scientist who is like, you know what, I think evolution has occurred. As we saw when we were looking at the treeoflife.org, you saw thousands of studies from fields of embryology, geology, anthropology, biology, biochemistry that back this up, and obviously there's many more. So this is not just a small theory, this is an explanation for what we see over and over and over again throughout our world. So Evidence of evolution. The first piece of evidence of evolution that we are going to focus on is comparative anatomy. Comparative means that you're comparing things. You're looking at similarities or differences between different species, and anatomy is just body structure. So comparative anatomy is comparing body structures and functions between species. The key to this is homologous structures. There are organisms which are related, and you can see that they're related because they have very similar structures. For instance, humans, dogs, birds, and whales all have very similar forelimbs where they have one long bone, two thinner bones, a cluster of small bones, and then some digits. And that same array of bones is shown in all of those, and that's because they shared a common ancestor. It's a result of them having a common ancestor. Also, the furcula or wishbone in dinosaurs, living birds, that transitional fossil Archaeopteryx, that not quite a reptile, not quite a bird species. Then, of course, all living organisms on this planet have DNA and RNA. That is the biggest comparative anatomy of all. It is a living thing because it has DNA and or RNA. So that is common to all organisms. Meaning we all have a common ancestor. Second is the fossil record. We've spent some time with this year. The fossil record shows us that some things that used to be alive are no longer alive. Like, did you see a pterodactyl this morning on your way to school? Probably not. Also, we don't have any evidence of Homo sapiens prior to a certain date in the geologic record. So we can see that some things began and other things ended, which means what happened and how did life start all over again? Well, life didn't start all over again. We continue to evolve, and some things were successful as the environment changed, and some things died off, and some had babies and mutated and became new species. So comparative anatomy actually reveals common structures throughout geologic time, and species which serves as those transition organisms, those transition fossils. So Archaeopteryx, again, was a transition between dinosaurs and reptiles and present-day birds. The coelacanth does live today, but we didn't know that for a while because it's been in fossil record up to 350 million years ago and not changed much during that time. Its fins, its lobed fins, are evidence of it being a transition organism between aquatic vertebrates, those things with a spine that live in the water, and land vertebrates, because its fins, instead of having those thin toothpick-type ray fins, it has more the bony thing that we were just talking about that are more common for terrestrial or land vertebrates. Of course, there's the Homo naledi and Lucy that we spoke about earlier this year that are pre-Homo sapien species that are showing that delineation towards present-day humans. Next on our list is evidence of evolution is biogeography. Basically, it's that observation that things that are similar live near one another. A common example for this are the marsupials, those cute, cuddly creatures that you see there on the screen. They're highly concentrated in Australia, and that's because they are a more primitive design of organism. They actually have babies that are almost like what we consider premature, and they have to mature in the pouch of the parent before they can live independently. Those mammals were created and developed when Pangea was together. And then as Australia branched off on its own, it had marsupials and kind of did their own thing, and they became lots of different types, where the rest of that supercontinent, and as it started to drift apart, started to develop placental mammals. And placental mammals include us, and there are some advantages to that, right? The babies are stronger and more developed, and that's going to help in their survival. And so they replaced and outcompeted the marsupial mammals for the most part. So we in North America have opossums, where in Australia they have koalas and wallabies and wombats and kangaroos and all these other things that are marsupials over there because the placental mammals didn't come. And in other places of the world, the placental mammals outcompeted the marsupials, and so there's very, very few Also, we had those Darwin's finches. They had a common ancestor, came to the Galapagos, and then differentiated from there. This divergent evolution. And when scientists recently went and DNA tested those finches, they found that they were more similar in these 13 species of finch on the Galapagos were more similar to one another than any one of them were to the species on the mainland. So then, of course, last but certainly not least is direct observation. We actually have seen evolution occur. We see it every year with antibiotic resistance, which, as you can see in the diagram, before selection you might have a small percentage of organisms represented by the darker red that are resistant to a certain medicine, say penicillin. And then you treat that sickness with penicillin, and of course, the ones who aren't resistant to it kick the bucket. They're dead. They're gone. They're not reproducing. They're not creating more of themselves, which means less competition for those ones that are resistant. And so those resistant ones, instead of just being a very small percent, suddenly are the majority. And then you've got all these resistant bacteria instead as the final population, and it just increases and increases. We've seen that happen quickly, even. For instance, it also happens with chemical agents like DDT. After the first use, it was effective on 90% of pests. But after even the second year, they were finding that only 45% of pests were affected by DDT. The new species within the Galapagos, within 30 years, scientists who have been studying that every single year have actually watched a new species come. When a new species came and mated, they differentiated with their song, where they didn't recognize one another, and became an entire new species. And they've watched this happen during our lifetimes. So, now that we know that there is evidence of evolution, we have different types of evolution. The first type that we're going to talk about is divergent evolution. Divergent means it splits. So they had a common ancestor that, because of different environments, because remember it's always related to the environment, so due to variation in environmental conditions, they became more speciated, more different types of species. So you can see here the very classic picture of Darwin's finches, which we just spoke about. They had one common ancestor, came over, and then went to the different islands and decreased competition. The reason you're going to have divergent evolution is because the more variation you have, the less competition you have, and that works in everyone's benefit. Second is convergent evolution. This is where unrelated species or very distantly related species, because technically we're all related to that one microorganism that was the first life on this planet, but distantly related organisms develop similar physical traits as a result of having a similar environment. Classic example here is your penguin, tuna, and whale. That is a bird, a fish, and a mammal all have that fusiform body and that torpedo-shaped body. That's because they all live in the water. That is going to be advantageous. That is going to help their survival no matter what you're eating, no matter what your relationship is. Historically, everyone is converging. The successful species have that body shape if they live in the water. So that's convergent evolution, where you have lots of different things coming together. So your keys to remember is that evolution is an explanation for observations in biology, paleontology, embryology, anatomy, etc. Species are related by common ancestors, which pass down successful traits to offspring and then differentiate based on environmental conditions. And again, humans are not descendants from chimpanzees. Rather, we share common ancestry. As you can see in the phylogenetic tree posted, humans are underneath that genus Homo at the bottom, where chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, are in the genus Pan. We share hominini, the common ancestor. And if you go back even further, you can see that we share homininae with gorilla. And if you go even further, you can see that we share hominidae with orangutan, which are in that genus Pongo. So, this has been another more keys of evolution, are that the comparative anatomy, the fossil record, biogeography, and direct observation. You can see there the progression of human Homo sapien lineage as well. So this has been a review of evolution and natural selection. I appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully you learned something.